Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Among his essays, Michel de Montaigne has a very interesting one titled On the Inconstancy of Our Actions. And there he's going to raise a number of criticisms about not just people and the fact that they're inconsistent, even contradictory in what it is that they do, but even more in those who want to try to find an interpretation that shoehorns people into being this type and assumes or ascribes a constancy that in most cases, there are some rare exceptions, in most cases is not actually there when we're being a bit more careful and realistic in looking at people. So he begins by saying, those who strive to account for a person's actions, deeds translated here, it's actually actions humaines, are never more bewildered than when they try to knit them into one whole and to show them under one light. Why? Because those actions commonly contradict each other in so odd a fashion it seems impossible they should all come out of the same shop. And he's going to give a few examples, but notice what he says there. He's not just saying there's a contradiction and that happens a lot. He's saying in a weird way, right? So even if we think that we've got a handle on the range of contradictions, we'd be like, well, people tend to contradict themselves in this way. There's always outliers. There's always things coming from the proverbial left field. And he gives examples, here, young Marius now acts like a son of Mars, meaning very martial. Now is a son of Venus, sexual attraction. They say Pope Boniface the Eighth took up his duties like a fox, bore them like a lion, and died like a dog, right? So we don't have to go on with more and more examples. There's contradictions or inconsistencies there. And he says everything is so full of such examples. In fact, each person can furnish many from themselves, as Montaigne is going to do later. I find it strange to find men of understanding, entendement, intelligent people, sometimes taking such trouble to match up the pieces, seeing that vacillation, irrésolution in French, seems to be the most common and blatant defect of our nature. So he goes on and he says, it seems reasonable enough to base a judgment of a person on the more usual features of their life, but we got to be careful. Why? Because there is a natural inconstancy of our behavior, our mores, our habits, and our opinions. So even good authors are wrong in trying to, I love this metaphor here, trying to weave us into one invariable and solid fabric. We're actually kind of a mixture and a mess. And then he says, here's how people actually go wrong. They select one universal character, and then following that model, they classify and interpret all the actions of a great man. And then they're surprised when everything doesn't map onto that. And then he says, if they cannot twist them the way they want, they accuse the person of insincerity. And he uses the example of Caesar Augustus, who did a lot of different things, right? And he says that Augustus did get away from them. There is in that man throughout his life a diversity of action so clear, so sudden and interrupted. They had to let him go in one piece. But of man I can believe nothing less easily than invariability, nothing more easily than variability. And he goes on, now he's not going to say everybody is inconsistent, because he says, okay, if I look in ancient times, there's maybe a dozen people who actually groomed their lives to follow an assured and definite course, though that is the principal aim of wisdom. So what is the ideal of wisdom? Having one single, consistent approach in life, as he's going to cite here, always wanting the same thing, always not wanting the same thing, right? And he says, I would not condescend to add, provided your willing be right, for if it's not right, you can't actually remain one and the same. So, the end and perfection of virtue, which is what we actually want to cultivate, is consistency. And the implication here is, well, most of us are not all that wise or virtuous, right? We can behave in virtuous ways once in a while. We're going to see a lot of discussion of courage in just a bit. But are we really that way? Some people are, but there are exceptions, right? So he says, I once was taught that vice is no more than a defect and irregularity of moderation, and it's impossible to tie it to consistency. What about virtue? All virtue begins with reflection and deliberation and ends in constancy. And so if we were to, by reasoning, adopt one definite way, then the way we choose would be the most beautiful, the most virtuous of all, but we don't choose that. We actually do a whole bunch of other different things. So now he talks about our normal course, and in the course of that, he's going to say, it is all motion and inconstancy. What do? We follow the inclinations of our appetite. Winds of occasion bear us along. What we want is only in our thought for the instant we want it. So he actually says we're like chameleons. We change our colors. That's what we're more like. We wind up, choosing something but not sticking to it, and we're just dragged or borne along. He says, we do not go. We're borne along like things afloat, now bobbing, now lashing about as waters are angry or serene. Every day a new idea, and our humors change with the changes of weather. He also talks about our intellectual life. We float out among different councils, and then this great line, are willing of anything. So even our greatest faculty, the will, our willing of anything is never free, final, or constant, meaning that there's all sorts of things impacting us, and they drive us in different ways. It takes an incredible will, which only a few people have developed, to stick with something. And now he's going to bring up a great example of a person like that, the legendary Cato the Younger, the great Stoic, perhaps sage of antiquity, who fought against Caesar, was a colleague of Cicero. So he says, it would be easy enough to explain the character of such a man. Look at the younger Cato. Strike one of his keys and you have struck them all. Now, isn't that an interesting metaphor there? Pick any part of him and it's going to be consistent with the other parts. And he says, you get a harmony of sounds in perfect concord, such as no one can deny. Now, are we Cato? No, he goes on and says, in our cases, on the contrary, every one of our actions needs to be judged on its own because they don't map onto each other. And he gives some interesting other examples. So he talks about this woman who threw herself from a high window to avoid being forced by some soldier, billeted on her, meaning living in her house. She was not killed by her fall, repeated her attempt by trying to slit her own throat with a knife. She was stopped from doing so only after she'd given herself a nasty wound. She admitted that the soldier had not yet gone beyond importuning her with requests, that is saying, hey, I want to have sex with you. solicitations and presents, but she was afraid he would eventually use force. So what does she do? She tries to kill herself so that he can't rape her. And everyone's like, wow, such chastity. She's, like this legendary virgin of ancient Rome. Well, as it turns out, doing a little bit of investigation, she slept with a lot of guys before. She also slept with a lot of guys after. So she's not really chaste. She just doesn't want to have sex with this guy. She's not going to be forced by him. Then he brings up some examples of soldiers. So Antigonus loved one of his soldiers for virtue and valor and ordered his doctors to treat him for an internal complaint which tormented him. Once the soldier was cured, he's not so brave anymore, right? Why was he so brave? He was like, well, I didn't hold my life as valuable. Now I actually do. He brings up another soldier of Lucullus who'd been robbed of everything by the enemy and made a fine attack on him. And Lucullus is trying to urge him to do more of this. And he says, you should try making some other wretched soldier who lost everything. And then finally, we have another more close in time example, a soldier of Mehmet who had insulted and berated the chief of his janissaries for allowing his line of battle to be broken by the Hungarians. Chasan's only reply was, alone and just as he was, weapon in hand, to charge madly against the first group of enemy soldiers. Of course, he gets killed. And, so it even shows us that these sorts of examples aren't consistent, right? So that's quite interesting. And then we're going to get a really interesting speculation, which, by the way, shows up as a trope in a lot of our cartoons and memes and stuff like that. If you've ever seen the angel on one shoulder and the devil on another shoulder, here's an example of it in Montaigne's essay. He says that the changes and contradictions seen in us human beings are so flexible, some have imagined that we have two souls, others two angels, which bear us company and trouble us each in his own way, one turning us towards good, the other towards evil, right? So what is it two angels? Yes, because the devil is a fallen angel, right? So that's an interesting idea there. And he says, if we actually examine ourselves, if we're being honest with ourselves, then we will hardly ever find ourselves in the same state twice. And he goes on and he says, I speak about myself in many different ways because I look at myself in diverse ways. Every sort of contradiction can be found in me, depending on some twist or attribute. Timid, insolent, two opposites to each other. Chaste, lecherous. Talkative, taciturn, tough, sickly, clever, dull, brooding, affable, lying, truthful, learned, ignorant, generous, miserly, and then prodigal. So 3 different ones with that one. And he says, I can see something of all that in myself depending on how I turn myself around. And anyone who studies himself will find in himself and his very judgment this worrying around and this discordancy. And he says, the part of logic that is most important for me is this, distinguo. I make a distinction, right? I separate two things out from each other because I'm not a whole. He goes on and says, I always mean to speak well of what is good and to interpret favorably anything that can possibly be taken that way. But our human condition is so strange, it leads to our being brought by vice itself to do good, except that doing good is to be judged solely by our intentions. And now we get to this discussion of courage. One courageous action must not be taken as proof that a person is truly brave. If they're really brave, you'll be brave on all occasions. You need to look at the totality of responses, how this bravery transfers from one context to the next. So just to give you one of the many examples that he gives here, if a person is unyielding against swords of their adversary but cannot bear a barber surgeon's lancet, right? A much smaller blade. Think about somebody today who's great with, fighting in a gunfight, right? They're super tough. but they're afraid of needles. Right? That's not true courage, he would say, right? He says there's no valor greater in its kind than Alexander, the Macedonian king in general, but it's only one kind of valor. We know that Alexander also was superstitious. That's a sort of fearfulness, right? And he also murders some of his friends and then shows inconstancy of mind. So Montaigne is going to say, look, we are made of disparate drives and elements. We're fashioned out of oddments put together, right? And virtue, if we actually had it, would in fact make us constant. He says, once the soul is steeped in her, it's a strong and living dye which never runs without taking the material with her. That's why, if we want to judge whether somebody is genuinely virtuous, we need to follow a person's tracks long and carefully. If his constancy does not rest firmly on its own foundations, if changes make him change his pace or his path, right, then that person is not constant in their actions. And what would allow us to do this? He says a definite plan of life. If we don't want to be so subject to chance, to whatever is happening inside of us, our temperaments, our drives, our appetites, or external circumstances, then we have to deliberately choose a kind of target, a goal, an end. He says that it's impossible to put the pieces of your life together if you don't have in your head an idea of the whole. What's the use of providing yourself with paints if you don't know what to paint, if you don't have an idea of it? And so if we want to have some sort of constancy, we would need to follow that course, and not just a bit, but all the way, right? So he's going to finish up by saying we're entirely made of bits and pieces, woven together diversely and shapelessly. Each of them pulls its own way at every moment, and there's as much difference between us and ourselves as there is between us and other people. So this is the human condition, and that's the challenge before us. If we value constancy, we have to work at it. It doesn't just come to us. We have to make a decision. We have to prioritize it. And that is, as he's going to say, quite difficult. And he says, this is where he actually concludes, it's not the act of a subtle judgment to judge us simply by our outward deeds. We have to probe right down inside and find out what principles make things move. But this is a deep undertaking and a difficult or chancy one. And so he says, I'd like that fewer people would concern themselves with it. We come back to this mistake that so many people make in thinking, I've studied somebody a bit, I know their character, I'll write about them, I'll make judgments about them. And so often we get this wrong. So, very interesting set of reflections on Montaigne from his experience and observation, as well as perusal of many other people's thoughts on this matter, takes to be a fairly universal human trait of not being entirely consistent with our actions, our views, our motivations.